Our second talk for this block is Time and Time Again by Yaakov, who is a principal software engineer at WiseTech Global. Is that what you do these days?
Yes.
Yeah. He's also an occasional speaker, an open source contributor, and yes, a reverse engineer, and a hacker and a problem solver, and an amateur radio operator. And yes, he does talk about Pokemon a lot. What he hasn't said in his bio is it was actually the session co-chair, the program co-chair last year for PyCon AU. So if you had problems like last year trying to decide which talk you were going to because they're all scheduled against each other, you can just blame Yaakov. He's here for you. Thank you.
My apologies and thank you. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land where we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Past and present. When I started writing this talk, I was wondering, how far can you get through a talk on time without actually mentioning time? Like even a simple good morning, you've got one word. And in acknowledgement of country, I counted about 32, and then I suddenly realized now that today mentions time, and start gives you only 4 words in. It's very hard to escape time. Time is very pervasive in everything we do. A while ago, I was mindlessly scrolling through memes on Facebook, which is pretty much all it's good for these days, and I came across a tech comedian. Please forgive me, I do not remember who it was. I couldn't find it again when I went looking. If you recognize this, let me know afterwards. But it was a tech comedian who was talking about the perfect calendar design. What would happen if he got to rewrite the calendar so it was easier? It was something like this. The year would be made up of 52 weeks, but they would be divided into 13 months of exactly 4 weeks each, and they would each contain 7 days. This would simplify a lot of calculations, because the first day of every week and of every month would be a Sunday. The last day of every week and the last day of every month would be a Saturday. And you could figure out which day of the week something was just by doing some simple division and remainder, really nice and easy. But if you're doing some very quick maths in the back there, that doesn't add up to 365. That gets you 364. So we need one more day. So in order to account for the imperfection of this calendar, we'll have an additional day inserted between the end of one year and the start of the next. And this day doesn't belong to any week, it doesn't belong to any month, it doesn't belong to any year. So the year would end on Saturday. Then you would have a day of limbo, and then you would have a Sunday. And instead of having leap years, we would just have 2 days of limbo. You get 2 days off, 2 days to do nothing, and then you'd start again on what would be a Sunday. Now, this sounds to me like exactly the sort of calendar system you would come from a certain orange website arguing, a calendar system shouldn't be so hard, I managed to build myself one in the weekend, like, it's not so bad. Unfortunately, this isn't a loose hypothetical from tech comedy. In the early 20th century, I found out later, this was known as the Cotsworth Plan, or the International Fixed Calendar, and was a serious contender by the League of Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations, to be selected as the new calendar system. The calendar would allow for improved statistical comparisons of monthly and quarterly data, as all months and all quarters would be an equal length. They'd have a whole number of weeks, they'd all have the same number of weekends, the same number of Saturdays, like all your sales stats would line up really, really nicely. And events such as public holidays, daylight savings changes, anything whose date fluctuates to match a particular weekday could now be assigned a fixed, easily predictable date. This could have been revolutionary. But the impact of this on religious life would have been very significant. The blank day finds no origin that I can find in any religion or any other previous culture, so you would have to shift, you would have to adapt. Like the Jewish weekly day of rest, Shabbat, and that's why I wasn't here yesterday. It was a day of rest, not coming to a conference. But that occurs every 7 days. So on the current calendar system, it's every Saturday. On this calendar system, well, it would be every Saturday the first year, and then every Friday the second year, and every Thursday the third year, and so on. So this would make it really, really difficult for Jews to maintain observance of Shabbat, along with things like, employment, kind of important. There's a story I was reading a number of months ago when I was putting together this talk, and it really lined in perfectly. One day, Rabbi Avram Kalmanovitz arrived suddenly in Otwosk in Poland. He had an important matter and demanded to speak urgently with Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, because several major rabbis were opposing this calendar reform by the League of Nations. They didn't quite know how to ward it off. Rabbi Schneerson's response was actually simple but genius, not to prepare a submission for the League of Nations or to debate the proposal, but just request a postponement for a later date. Like, we need a bit more time. argued you need a bit more time, you need to properly deliberate it and see what happens. After all, if you put in a submission, you could risk an immediate and unwanted verdict. But if you request for delay, you could end up stalling the proposal out entirely. And indeed, that's what ended up happening. The League of Nations proposed a reform and deliberated from 1923 until 1937, where the outbreak of World War II triggered the collapse of the League of Nations. And despite all the time and money poured into this calendar reform, it disappeared along with the League. But the League of Nations isn't the only time people have tried to come up with different calendar systems. As another example, and another one I know from impacting Jewish life, the USSR have tried this a couple times. They tried a calendar with a 5-day week, as seen here, and a calendar with it's officially a 6-day week. It shows 7 days, but the public day of rest, so your weekend is every 6 days in the blue square, which, yeah, it's very weird. The point of all this is that time is incredibly subjective. What you think of time, what the League of Nations thinks of time, and what 3,000 years of Jewish practice thinks of time, and what the Soviets thought of time. These can all be completely separate things, despite the fact that they all coexist in the same stream of time with no alternate or parallel universes that we know of. We're living in the same time, but we experience it differently. So today, let's have a look at time from more than just the usual Western perspective. And let's mute my laptop while I'm at it. Let's try and get a better understanding of what time actually is, if we can, how we express and communicate it, and how we can use this knowledge to avoid bugs, build more reliable software, and build more accurate computer systems for diverse audiences. AV, that mute didn't seem to work, so if you can mute it from your end, all good. So let's start with time, but really let's start by looking at space. They kind of go together. Without getting into weird particle physics, we all know that two things can't really exist in the same space, because the real world does run with physics collisions enabled. In a hypothetical one-dimensional world, there'd only be two directions of movement. You can go left, or you can go right. If you're in that world, you might consider it forwards or backwards. I don't know, I've never lived in one. But this is severely limiting, and to be honest, it would be the worst game of Snake ever, because you can't even turn around. Two things just can't share the same coordinate. If you've got a number line, 6 and 7 are at different spaces. If you look at a two-dimensional world, we know, again, you can only have one thing at each addressable point. You can now move up, down, left, or right, but you can't share space with something else. Two things can share an x-coordinate or a y-coordinate, but not both. On a screen like this one or that one, each pixel only has one color. You can't have two things occupying one pixel unless you can blend it, but that changes it into something else. It's a third thing. It's not the first two combined. And no, I'm not going to get into subpixels. That's not the point of this. In a three-dimensional world, we have the same problem. We have now 6 directions of movement, but again, we can't share the same physical space with something else. You can share 2 of your x, y, and z coordinates, or z for the Americans, but not all 3. If we could, then I would have a problem, because gravity would keep pulling me through this stage and straight down. Like the fact that my feet can't occupy the same space as my shoes, and my shoes can't occupy the same space as the stage the floor, and so on, is all that is stopping me from being sucked up and burned by the fiery core of the planet down below, which is really best not to think about. In all these cases, though, we have movement because we have the additional dimension of time. Time is often referred to as the 4th dimension, and it's interwoven with space in both science, such as Einstein's theories about space-time, and in popular culture, such as Pokemon Diamond and Pearl have the legendary Pokemon of space and time. You can share all your coordinates with something else, but as long as it's a different time, we take turns. Time is what allows for things to change. The world's in a particular state, then the world's in a different state, and then it's in a different state yet again. As time flows, things move, grow, age, and decay. But how we perceive all of this is entirely cultural. There is no fundamental rule of the universe or fundamental rule of computer science for how to describe space or time, how to describe chunks of it, how to describe the difference between them. Over the centuries, space has been measured in meters, feet, handbreadths, light years, and so on. For those who use meters, 1 meter was originally defined as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole. Nowadays, it's defined as the distance traveled by light in a vacuum in 1/299,729,458th of a second, which again is a certain measurement of time. The two are linked. A second was originally defined relative to a day. You divide the app into pieces and you land up with a second. So it would be 1/86,400th of a day. Nowadays, it's measured as the base unit, based on the frequency of cesium-133. We're going back into particle physics. These evolved from the previous definitions into the SI system, the International System of Units, which is the general system used to measure things in most countries all around the world and officially recognized by their governments. Although that's how we officially recognize it on paper with mathematical formula, that's not necessarily how we perceive of time or think of it on a regular basis. Humanity in storytelling and in art regularly dreams of being able to stop time or travel through time, forwards or backwards, or even what could exist beyond time. But although we all move through time at a rate of exactly 1 second per second, no more and no less, we usually use other expressions to describe a time rather than only seconds. Like this talk slot is 30 minutes. It's not 16.5 billion oscillations of cesium. We don't think of it like that. It started at 10 past 2, not at some number of oscillations since, well, when exactly? We need a common reference point if we want to make sure that you and I are talking about the exact same point in time. So let's talk about calendars. Calendars are, well, they describe the continuous stream of time by dividing it into addressable chunks relative to some common reference point. So we can schedule things like talks, breaks, shipments, meetings, stand-ups, and so on. As I mentioned at the start, there was the idea of the international fixed calendar, but that went nowhere. So the one that most of you are probably familiar with would be the Gregorian calendar, the colonial calendar of Christianity named after Pope Gregory XIII. This is what you would think of by default. We've got our 12 months, 7 days in a week, days start and end at midnight, and so on, and it is full of edge cases. It replaces its predecessor, the Julian calendar, named after Julius Caesar of the Roman Empire, who established it, and that was a modification of the original Roman calendar, established by King Romulus, who founded Rome. Be honest, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? For me, it's whenever I look at a calendar. Now, if I ask many of you here, what's the best way to express a date or time value, you would probably refer me to ISO 8601, which is the date and time format specified by the International Standards Organization. I see a few nods, so definitely some fans here. But unfortunately, being an ISO standard, you have to pay quite a bit of money to get your hands on the actual text. Fortunately for me, the US Library of Congress has what looks like a draft version up from 2016, publicly available, and that quite clearly states, this international standard uses the Gregorian calendar for the identification of calendar days. So Roman and Christian colonization have been so effective that this has become the global standard. If you want to express dates and times from any other calendar system, you're out on your own. The Standards Organization doesn't cover you. Python does something very similar. The date time type doesn't seem to work well with other calendar systems, and the documentation says, assuming the current Gregorian calendar always was and always will be in effect, which is hilarious because it probably won't always will be. I'm sure we'll come up with something else and another set of edge cases to program for. It also definitely wasn't always was. Absolutely not. Also, it explodes if I try and represent a date not sanctioned by the Pope. I've got a 13th month here and it doesn't like that. I actually find this quite funny because before Julius Caesar, the Roman calendar had extra intercalary months. So this idea of there only being 12 months is a relatively recent thing. But before the Gregorian calendar, we had the Julian calendar, and this is still used today by some sects of Christianity, as well as apparently the Berber people of northern Africa. But it was also the calendar used all across Europe prior to Pope Gregory's calendar reform. So if you're trying to do anything with dates before the late 16th century, you're going to have to do a whole bunch of adjustments to translate between the two calendar systems. And since there was no NTP back then, and no wide-scale coordination, the changeover between calendars is also region-specific. So good luck, and may the force be with you. The next calendar I would expect you'd be somewhat familiar with is the financial calendar. I haven't even gotten into it yet. This is almost exactly the same as the Gregorian calendar, except the year ends with the month of June and starts with the month of July. That's right, the year increments on the first day of the 7th month. Usually this is distinguished by the FY moniker on year numbers, or usually it's actually partial year numbers. We have FY25, FY26. We are building up to another Y2K problem at this point. Following this, we also then have the idea of dividing years into quarters, with quarter 1, Q1 being July through September, Q2 being October through December, and so on. Disclaimer for any foreigners or people watching the recording, this is Australia. Other countries do similar things, including, I think, somebody, I don't remember who I was talking to, had February to February. That's why be off by 1 month? But like, different countries do different things, different economic systems. By the way, there's also something called the ISO week numbering year, or the ISO year. the international fixed calendar didn't disappear completely. So for financial purposes, they devised a calendar which looks almost exactly like the Gregorian calendar, except every year has 52 or 53 weeks, and every week starts on a Monday and ends on a Sunday. This year is used in a number of libraries if you try and format the year as Y in capitals rather than Y in lowercase. I don't believe Python has this. I don't believe .NET has this. I'm pretty sure Java has this, and I know Swift and Objective-C have this. So keep an eye out for this in your code, as it can end up being wrong right around New Year's when everyone's on holiday. I also haven't checked to see if like Beware Interop deals with this or not, so just keep an eye out for uppercase Ys. Also, if you're programming, you probably don't want all 4 Ys. Not every calendar is up to 4 digits at the moment, so just 1 Y and it'll fill it in. And then the next calendar that I'm the most familiar with is the Hebrew calendar, or the Jewish calendar, depends what framework or SDK you're talking about. I don't know if it has a name, it's just luach, which is the Hebrew word for calendar. And instead of being based on the oscillations of an atom or how long it takes the Earth to complete a full orbit of the sun, days are based on sunrise or sunset. Days run from sunset to sunset. Months are based on the orbit of the moon around the Earth, and years are 12 or 13 months, so that we don't get out of whack with the seasons. You know, your harvest festival needs to be when you're having your harvest. Interestingly, the Hebrew calendar does share a property with financial year, and that is the last day of the year is the last day of the 6th month, and the first day of the year is the first day of the 7th month. Annoyingly, I've yet to see a single framework support this. Both Objective-C and Swift treat the first day of the year as also the first day of the first month. And when I complained to Apple about this, they said they can't do anything. They just wrap libICU. It's up to international components for Unicode to do that. Also, in the times of the temple, as pictured here, the new month had to be declared by the courts when someone actually saw the new moon. So if it was cloudy and everybody slept in, all your computer calculations are wrong. There's also the Chinese calendar, also known as the lunar calendar, which, like the Hebrew calendar, is lunisolar. You've got your lunar months, and then you add an extra one so it doesn't get out of whack with the solar year. Despite being called the Chinese calendar, modern China mostly uses the Gregorian calendar, thanks to colonization. And it's mostly used for holidays such as the Chinese New Year and the Lantern Festival. My only interaction with it is when Chinese colleagues go on holiday for New Year's and when Pokemon and Overwatch have promotional events. And lastly, I couldn't not mention the Islamic calendar, which is famous among calendar systems for being entirely lunar. So months follow the moon. A year is 12 months. That ends up being 354, 355 days. And so since that's shorter than a solar year, it's not in sync with the previous calendar systems at all. So if you track, for example, the month of Ramadan, when Muslims, you may have coworkers, it might be you, who fast, it gets earlier and earlier every year if your primary frame of reference is a solar calendar. That said, there is apparently a solar variant used in Iran, but I don't know how that works. So let's talk about software. Now, given everything I've said about it being cultural and contextual, there is no one right way to write code that makes it perfect. But I do have some tips that should hopefully help. And the first one is learn your calendar systems. The entire software industry loves to write software relating to fields that we're not experts in. And then we also don't consult the experts. And then we wonder why our big multi-cloud, hyperscaling whatever doesn't actually solve the problem that we set out to solve in the first place. Learn how your calendar works. Learn about leap days or leap months. Learn about time zones, daylight savings, leap seconds, time drift, all the other ways your program may break. Go read one of the many compilations of falsehoods that programmers believe about time. There are a lot of them. I found they are all good. And I always come away surprised in learning something new that I didn't know beforehand. Whether it's the idea that some Muslim countries suspend and resume daylight savings around Ramadan, or in 2013 in the West Bank, Israelis and Palestinians were living in different time zones because Israel and the PA had different start and end dates. You could be neighbors and be an hour apart. There is always something funky and interesting to learn about time. If you're just throwing dates around without understanding what they mean and how they work, then let me draw your attention to this classic quote from Charles Babbage. On 2 occasions I've been asked, "Pray, Mr. Babbage, if you put into the machine wrong figures, will the right answers come out? I'm not able rightly to apprehend the kind of confusion of ideas that could provoke such a question." To be honest, I thought we had long understood the idea of garbage in, garbage out until these guys came along and they wanted garbage in, business out. But once you've learned how your calendar system works, you might then be tempted to run off and write all the necessary arithmetic and logic yourself. Like cryptography, please don't. Take your newfound knowledge and use it to build test cases and make sure your software works in as many ways and as many scenarios as possible. But lean upon the standard libraries when you have them to do the calculations correctly. I don't believe Python has all the calendars built in. There are some packages. Other frameworks like .NET and Swift and Objective-C do have a lot of stuff built in. Let me share with you a story of what happens if you don't. On February 28th, 2012, at 5:45 p.m. Pacific time, Microsoft became aware of an issue impacting Windows Azure Service Management in a number of regions. By the way, this predates naming of Microsoft Azure. Can anybody think maybe what might have gone wrong here? Does that date mean anything to you? What might have happened in other time zones? Here's their post-mortem blog post. They're talking about the connection between the hypervisor and the guest VM. There's a transfer TLS certificate that goes between them. It says when the GA creates a transfer certificate, it gives it a 1-year validity range. It uses midnight UST of the current day as the valid from date, and 1 year from that date as the valid to date. The leap day bug is that the GA calculated the valid to date simply by taking the current date and adding 1 to its year. You got February 29, 2013, which does not exist, and caused it all to fail. So basically, what they should have done was call the add years function, assuming it's .NET, because Microsoft are all .NET all the way down. Call the add years function to add 1 year. Instead, most likely, they deconstructed the date in an invalid manner. Now, you can argue if 1 year after 28th of February should be, 1 year after 29th of February should be the 28th of February, or if it should be the 1st of March. I would hope that this is a solved problem, particularly when you have intercalary months, because your whole month doesn't exist. You can't just shift 1 day. But either way, if you call add years, it might be off by a day, but it doesn't crash, and it definitely doesn't bring down the entire management plane of a global cloud compute platform. So use your libraries. They are there to help, unless they're wrong, in which case file bugs to help everyone. And learn them and learn what they do, learn the difference between the uppercase Y and the lowercase y, and read the documentation, really. Thirdly, make sure that when you have computer systems, plural talking time, that they speak the same language. Computers represent time in a few different ways. You have to make sure that when two computers talk, they mean the same thing. For example, Unix machines famously count the number of seconds since 1st of January 1970. Apple machines internally have an epoch 31 years later on the 1st of January 2001. I know Steam and some Valve software have internal data structures where they have an internal epoch of the 1st of January 2005 in Seattle. So that's Pacific Standard Time. That's not even UTC. And if you watch Tom Eastman's talk on UUIDs in DevOps on Friday, the UID v1 spec has a timestamp in 100 nanosecond intervals from midnight on the 15th of October 1582, which is the date of Gregorian reform to the Christian calendar in France. Remember, it wasn't global. This also raises an additional point. Here, each interval is 100 nanoseconds. Some systems will use seconds. Some will use milliseconds. I've definitely had that bug before. The time looks wrong. You divide by 1,000. Now it looks right. So just make sure that both ends are speaking the same language. And save all the data you need. If you're saving date and time data to a database, make sure you have everything. Time itself is not enough. Time and UTC offset is sometimes not enough as well. You may need a time zone if you have it. So like Melbourne or New York, so that you can add dates, subtract dates, figure out daylight savings changes. And if you are dealing with multiple calendars, make sure you keep them as well. And on that note, and there's a personal plea, but please support multiple calendars in personal applications. Users should be able to use the calendar that they know best for relevant events. So particularly for apps like calendars, diaries, even a to-do list, a date that has meaning in one calendar system could be meaningless converted into another. If I look at a date and it's mid-February, I don't know what that means. If it says Chinese New Year, I have some idea. Apple do this pretty well in the Phone Contacts app. You can log someone's birthday in the Gregorian calendar and in another calendar system, so you can celebrate their birthday with them culturally in the right calendar where they observe their birthday. Unfortunately, you can't select all 3 calendars, so any Arabic Jews in China are completely out of luck. They also don't support this for other events like wedding anniversaries or calendar events like holidays, which annoys me. And on Apple Watch, which doesn't actually have enough room to display the entire Hebrew date here, Apple just translate the current Gregorian date to the matching Hebrew date. They forgot what I said earlier about the days running from sunset to sunset rather than midnight to midnight. So my watch is wrong for about 4 to 8 hours every single day, depending on the time of year and my geographic location. And in theory, this shouldn't be hard to get right. There's already a watch complication with sunrise and sunset times. So the OS knows what it's doing, it just doesn't piece together everything. This comes back to my first point. If you're writing code to do something, make sure you know what that thing is so you have a decent chance of getting it right. Now, back in 2013, 2014, I was working on a little iPhone app that never went anywhere. And also in 2014, I took a trip to Seattle for the Dota 2 International Championships. And while I was there, I was trying TDD. I ran, and I wasn't competing, by the way. I was just spectating. But I ran all my unit tests, and 2 suddenly failed. And I had a look, and I had a logic bug that only worked in positive UTC offset. So my code worked anywhere east of Greenwich, failed anywhere west of Greenwich. For overseas companies as well, it can be really handy to have staff on the east coast of Australia. We're UTC plus 10 or 11, so if you hit a bug at midnight UTC, we're awake, we're ready to go. You're not rolling staff out of bed on call. They're half asleep, grabbing coffee, trying to figure out what's wrong on the computer. Also, if you have staff in other parts of the world that don't take holidays around the Gregorian New Year's, and you get a bug like an ISO week year bug or something like that, you have to get someone in to fix that. They might be on holidays. If you live somewhere without daylight savings, there are bugs you may never find. So if you can put your software through more diverse scenarios earlier, you find bugs earlier, you fix them earlier, hopefully your software is a bit more stable. And lastly, be aware of significant edge cases in how computers represent time. The 2038 bug, where the number of seconds since 1970 no longer fits into a signed 32-bit integer, is still coming upon us. And from what I read a while ago, its mitigation with 64-bit time in Fedora had a pretty disastrous rollout and had to be rolled back. So be prepared for that. Or do what I do, book some leave in advance for 2038. So that's not your problem. And if you're wondering what the second one is, that's the small date time column limit in Microsoft SQL Server. When I put that leave in, we had an unhandled exception somewhere. So if I'm still around and working by then, I'll see you 2 days later. Thank you.
Thank you, Yaakov. I think we've got a couple of minutes for questions, if anyone's got any. No, we are all in some kind of weird time loop. Yes. Would you?
Give me the mic, please.
Thank you, Yaakov. So you've mentioned interoperability, and because of the web, any language that you write, you have to interoperate with JavaScript. What are your recommendations in terms of libraries or practices for Python, JavaScript, making sure that you're doing the same thing?
I haven't worked a huge amount with JavaScript. I mean, my initial reaction is please don't, but it's something I'd have to look into.
Indeed. Any other questions? All righty. Thanks, everyone. 10-minute break.